here we are, we're on our farm, and we're walking into a little aspen thicket just behind my house. And you can actually see a little bit of last year's bear scat here. This is pretty weathered out, and this is from a black bear. We're walking into this little aspen thicket. And I think that this really illustrates some of the stuff that we're talking about, how closely bears live with people in this part of the world. This is not a big grove. It's about 100 yards from end to end. But it's still a pretty important resource for bears moving through a cultivated, farmed landscape, because it's one of the few wild places that remains out here in the valley floor. And we see bears here all the time, particularly in the fall when they're out looking for both wild and domestic fruit in the valley. And actually we have a willow tree back here where a bear, a black bear in this case, was day bedding for about a month and a half. It's a pretty gnarly old willow, and it's been used extensively by bears for day bedding. There's one bear in particular that was here for about a month last year, and I'll show you what he left behind. So if you come through here, you can see on the trunk of this tree, you can see the way the bear's actually worn the bark from climbing up. Oftentimes they'll leave claw marks, but this bark is thick enough that it hasn't here. You can also see this really large pile of bear scat right here, because we had a bear that was denning in the crook of this branch just above here, and was here long enough to leave a pile this big, which I think is pretty impressive. So you can see above us, yeah, the place where the bear was, and we expect him back this year. And this is all very close to our house. We're 50 yards away from, where I lay my head at night. So it's a really good illustration of the way that humans and bears use the same resources in this landscape. So we're just north of Missoula, Montana. We are on the edge of an agricultural valley, and behind me you can actually see the southern edge of the Mission Range. Those will be those large white peaks sticking up. The Rattlesnake Mountain Range and Rattlesnake Wilderness is just off in this direction. So we're at the edge of the domesticated landscape adjacent to wilderness in Montana. The book I've written is called Down from the Mountain, The Life and Death of a Grizzly Bear. And the book is largely about two things. It's about work that I was doing as a conservationist. I'm the field director for a small nonprofit group called People and Carnivores. It was work that I was doing for them up in the Mission Valley, just north of here and at the base of the mountains that you can see behind me. It's also about the story of a grizzly bear named Millie. And the book is really about the way my story and that bear's story converge, and what that says about the state of things in the American West in terms of the way we've used wild landscapes and the way that we're interacting with wild animals here. So I learned about Millie, one of the main characters, or one of the protagonists in Down from the Mountain. I learned about her story because of this work I was doing up in the Mission Valley. I was up there working on an experimental electric fence that I thought could keep grizzly bears out of a 100-acre cornfield. And it was a short little fence. It was no more than 2 or 3 feet tall, and it had shown a lot of promise in some smaller scale tests. So I was up there trying to use this fence for the first time in a large area. And it was really important because, if we could do that, if we could build this fence, which was cheaper, which was easier to build than historic bear fences, we could keep bears out of attractants like corn, which are really, really dangerous for them because they bring them into contact with people, and then they also do things physiologically to them that are really bad. They rot their teeth, they make them chronically obese, beyond the point that's actually good for a bear. So I was up there working on that project. And as part of that, I had a series of trail cameras set up around the cornfield to monitor how bears were interacting with this electric fence. And what I saw on one of those cameras one day was this just deeply injured, very damaged bear. Skin and bones, had a face that was just torn up from some sort of damage and infection. And from the moment I saw that, I thought, I felt a tremendous amount of concern and compassion, as anybody would, seeing an animal in that much visible pain, an animal that was clearly wounded to the point of being on death's doorstep. And she was inside my fence. She had somehow managed to cross. So our stories were entangled because we spent time close to each other in the context of that cornfield, and also because I began to wonder about what had done that damage to her. What had torn her up so badly that she couldn't live even in this food-rich environment. And so the book is largely about trying to figure out what happened to her and what her story, which is a simple, small story about a single animal, what that says about the way we've treated bears and what the future looks like for them and for us in the West. So the current state of things with grizzlies and human beings in this part of the world is actually, in spite of stories like Millie's, there's actually a really positive trend going on here. So grizzlies were protected by the Endangered Species Act, and since that time they've been making these slow, steady steps back from the brink of extirpation in the lower 48. And that's great news. But we stand at this really crucial moment right now because we have a grizzly population that's grown from 750-ish bears at its low point to a minimum count of 1,850 bears now. So we're seeing that growth, and that's a good thing. And we're seeing bears expanding outward from the places where they historically have held on into places like the valley that we're standing in. But we also see human beings beginning to use this landscape more intensively. More people are coming here all the time. There's more subdivision and fragmentation of habitat, and that's a really crucial problem for bears. The state of things for grizzlies and humans in the West it's at this crucial moment where we have to decide how much space we're going to make for these wild animals, particularly difficult wild animals like a grizzly. So when you come out here and you look at a landscape like the one that's behind me, you can see certain things. You can see that human beings are in it. You can see the buildings. You can see that some fields have been tended, that, rocks have been piled and picked out of the fields where people have farmed in the past. But you don't see, you don't see houses all over this landscape. You don't see such a density of people that it's unusable for a wild animal's purpose. And we have to maintain that. And there are ways we can do that. But it all boils down to showing some collective restraint, which is a really hard thing for people to do. I mean, we just historically have not done well at that. If there's a place you can put a house and you run 4 generations of people through a landscape, they often put a house there. And we have to break with that tradition. We have to be the first generation, I think, to leave the American West less settled and therefore more intact than we found it. And that's really what this book is about and what I hope to achieve in some small manner here on the farm. When I look at the next decades ahead and I feel despair, it's because I look at the past and what we've done to this place. Because every generation for the last couple hundred years that's been out here has left it less intact, less whole than they found it. And if we keep doing that, there's not going to be anything left. Or rather, what's going to be left are these island mountain ranges that are too rough to build upon, and all of the corridors that link places like that, where grizzly bears now thrive, and places where they could thrive again, like ones to the south of here, all those places are going to be filled up with people so that animals can't move. So we have to break with that model. And when I feel hope about the future, it's because I'm thinking about the good work that's starting to be done. So there are a few tools that people are already using to this end. Conservation easements, which protect parcels of private land from development. There's one on our farm. That's a great tool that protects in perpetuity. It actually travels with the deed of the property. So that's a profound thing that we can do to make sure that these landscapes stay open. Zoning laws that cities are beginning to enact around here. Zoning has long been a dirty word in our part of the world, but we need to embrace it. We absolutely do, or the thing that we love about this place, which is its wilderness and our ability to make a living from it as people who practice agriculture, that's going to go away. Because both wild animals and ranchers depend on open lands for their living. That is the nugget that I really want people to understand, is that, so often it's set up as this contest or conflict between people who want to practice agriculture and people who appreciate the value of wild animals. But that is a completely false divide. There are places where those two things, there's friction between them, and it's not always going to be a perfect coexistence. But the thing that's at the root of both, which is an undeveloped, unfragmented landscape, that's common to both. And I really want people to understand that that's common ground, and common ground that we have to sort of stand and fight on, or we will lose connectivity in the West for the purposes of wild animals, and we'll lose its utility for the purpose of agriculture. So Millie, the bear that's sort of at the heart of this book, her story is a sad one. She died as a result of her wounds. She basically wasted away in the cornfield until the tribal biologists had to actually put her down. And that was one of the clearest acts of of mercy that I've ever been a party to. She died and she left 2 orphan cubs. And those cubs are now in the zoo in Baltimore. And that's always it's a really complicated thing for me. Because I saw those cubs, you know, I've seen cubs like them in the wild. And the way a bear behaves, what their life is like in the wild versus in a zoo, there's no comparison. And often I sit there and think, you know, is it better for cubs like that to be dead or in a zoo? And that to me is an open question from their perspective. But one thing I am sure about is that from our perspective, as a species that's more and more urbanized and one that lacks connection to animals like Millie and the cubs, you know, it's a good thing for us. Because having those cubs there in the zoo allows people to see them and connect with them who would otherwise have no idea about this species. And we need that right now. I remember going to see these cubs in the zoo and sitting there next to, you know, at the railing, looking down into their exhibit. And I was feeling really low and sad. And this woman came up and stood next to me, and we got into talking about the cubs. And she said, you know, I bring my children here, and she had her little kids with her. I bring my children here because the next generation has to love animals. They have to know animals and love them. And I wish we could go to Yellowstone. I wish we could go to Glacier, to Montana, and see them in that context. But we can't. This is what we have, and this is enough to form a connection. So that's what happened to Millie's cubs. And I feel sad every time I think about them being there, because I know what a bear's life is like out here. And I know the distances they cross. I mean, you know, bears will den halfway up the steepest mountain that you can see behind me. But I also know what those cubs are doing there. They're being ambassadors for their species, and hopefully they're causing people to realize that there's true value in having these animals on the landscape, and that we need to do things, even difficult things, to make sure they stay on.